Yes, would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? All right, all ready to carry on?
Yeah, I've brought my glasses, so
It'll make a lot of difference.
Yeah.
Good. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Great, thank you. Yes, I just have a few more questions to ask you relevant to the existing fire safety strategy, and then we're going to move on to the refurbishment work that Exova did. Can we bring up now EXO 401279? Now, if you recall, this is an email that you referred to in your report. It's from Kate Cooney to Andrew Martin on the 17th of August 2012. And this is an email that we looked at in detail when Ms. Cooney gave evidence. And it's where she says towards the end, they're making an existing crap condition worse, so it's a matter of working the worst bits out and making the new stuff work. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you've read that email before?
Yes.
And if we go to paragraph 4.9.3 on page 113 of your report, you refer to that email there at 4.9.3. And then if we go on within page, at page 337 of your report into a further section at 14.1.330, you are referring to that email again, and you say there's no justification for making an existing crap condition worse. Now, given the strong language employed by Exova internally about how they saw the nature of the building, in your opinion, do you think it was incumbent on them to warn their client and the TMO and the design team that the plans for the refurbishment were likely to make the existing condition worse?
Yes, I do.
Now, if we go to page, sticking with that page, if we can look earlier at 14.1.26, you say the email seems to reflect a culture regarding the fire safety engineering standards of the Exova team. And then at 14.1.27, you say, I must stress this is not unique. Yeah. This email reflects a culture and behaviour I have experienced and observed elsewhere in the construction industry through my own professional work.
Yeah.
Now, just briefly, can you just explain to us what you mean there by that's a culture that you've experienced more generally in the industry? What do you mean by that?
So I think for me, fire safety engineering is about protecting people.
Yeah.
It's a massive responsibility, and I used the word scary earlier, and I mean that most sincerely. It's a massive responsibility. But when you forget that and you get caught up in the game of, making things work, getting things through, you forget about your primary responsibility, which is protecting people. And that has been a problem in the construction industry based on my own experience.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean regarding fire safety engineering professionals. I want to make that clear. Because, fire safety engineering professionals, we're one role player in a whole scheme of people who have duties to make things, to build things, ultimately to build things properly, and so they're, you can even say, fit for purpose, and so the buildings can be operated safely. And the only reason for doing that is to protect people in the event of a fire, and there are people in the building and the firefighters.
Yeah. Okay.
And that ties back to all these other things I've been saying earlier about the definition of fire safety engineering and getting confused about methodologies. So whether you use a prescriptive methodology or a performance-based methodology, whether you're writing an existing fire strategy or a detailed fire strategy, the ultimate purpose is to protect human beings.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. On the back of that, would you accept that it is at least a part of a fire consultant's role to identify the bits of a proposal that would make the compliance position worse and work out ways to address them?
I think that is our job.
Yeah. Now, you refer earlier in your report on page 112 to paragraph 4.9.2. You refer to a separate email that Ms. Cooney sent to Mr. Ashton on the 10th of September 2012.
Yep.
And I think if we go over the page, so you say, I note that there was some crossover. Sorry, no, go back to that. You say, I note there was some crossover between the teams. Ms. Cooney provided commentary back to other Exova staff on 2 occasions, presented below regarding the condition of the existing building and therefore how the refurbishments may affect fire safety in the building. And then if we go over the page, I think we see it up 4.9.5 right at the bottom of that page, reference to the 10th of September email that she sent to Mr. Ashton. So we can see you've taken that into account in your report.
Yeah.
Can I just take you to that email, EXO 50388? Now, this is her email to Terry Ashton. It's on the 10th of September 2012, and she's setting out her thoughts on the possible solution to Grenfell Tower, general fire line markup attached to clarify below. And then there's a number of headings, and I'm not going to take you through the detail of it. But would you accept that what Ms. Cooney's doing here is identifying the worst bits in the proposals and trying to find ways in which they could be worked out?
Well, I don't know why. I don't know the technical reasons Kate Cooney had for saying the refurbishment was going to make things worse.
Right.
I don't know that I've read. I hope I haven't missed some correspondence, but
Yeah.
I haven't read where she wrote down why she said that.
I see.
Okay.
Okay.
So I just want, because I feel the need to just be very precise, because in an inquiry, so I don't know that this list she's sending Terry is emanates from things she saw in the primary refurbishment that was making the situation worse.
I see. Okay.
Okay.
But perhaps I can just ask, in giving the opinions in your report, you have taken into account this correspondence. You've seen this email before.
I've seen this email.
Yeah.
Okay. But I don't know that this is a list of the things that Kate Cooney thought meant the primary refurbishment was making things worse.
Yeah.
I actually don't understand that point at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
I understand.
Okay. So I have read this email, and I see it as her giving some advice to Terry Ashton.
Yeah.
I don't know what prompted her to give him that advice.
Yeah.
And I don't know how it relates to her opinion that the primary refurbishment was going to make things worse.
Yeah, I understand. Okay. Now, just on the existing fire safety strategy, your conclusions are set out at section 5.7 of your report. If we go back to that, page 157 and 158. And I showed you these before, and if we can go to the next page, 5.7.2 at the bottom, you've said it's inadequate for any relevant purpose.
Yeah.
And then I think over the page were the other conclusions that I showed you earlier. Now, I just want to check with you, have any of those conclusions changed as a result of the oral evidence you've heard from the Exova witnesses, and particularly Kate Cooney and Dr. Claire Barker?
No.
No. Okay, the refurbishment work now.
Yeah.
I want to discuss that with you. But before we get to the detail of that, I want to just ask you some questions about the RIBA stages of work.
Yeah.
Now, if we look at page 336 of your report, and I want to look at paragraph 14.1.16, you say this, you say the significant milestone documents any practicing engineer, fire engineer, relies upon as a matter of course, such as the stage C, D, E reports by the architect and mechanical and electrical, what's MEP stand for? Yeah.
mechanical and electrical and plumbing
engineer were available to them in the exact same way as they were for every other member of the design team. Yet I found no evidence those documents were ever considered. Now, we're going to come back to this paragraph of your report later, but sticking with the first words you used there about them being significant milestone documents, can you explain why you say that?
Yeah. So when you're working to the REBA stages, which happened at the primary refurbishment, at the end of each stage, the design team produces, you could nearly call it a record of what's occurred and what's been done in that stage. The fire safety engineer has a very important role before those reports are issued because of the coordination exercise that's needed.
Yeah.
The updating of the strategy, and so the final version of each one of those milestone reports. So there's toing and froing, so that at the end of the stage, the architect's report, the MEP engineer's report, and the fire safety strategy are aligned and coordinated.
Yeah.
So our strategy reports have to follow that process. And also, if you haven't had the opportunity to participate in them, which you should have, you must have read them before you enter the next stage. For example, if I was appointed during stage D, which might happen, I would ask to read the stage C report in full so I could understand the thinking of the professional design team.
Yeah, I understand. In your view, would any reasonably competent fire engineer know that these were significant milestone documents which were important for them to read on any project they were involved with?
Yes.
And are those reports sometimes long? Are they sometimes lengthy documents?
The milestone reports?
Yeah, the RIBA, say the stage C report or the stage D report.
Are they long?
Are they sometimes long?
Yes.
If long, would you still expect a fire engineer to ask for and read those reports?
Yes.
And read the entirety of them?
Yes, I would. Yes, I do.
Now, if we go to page 40 of your report, table 3.1, what you've done here, and this is in an early section of your report, is you have you fit various parties and the work that they did into the different RIBA stages, yes?
Their appointment status.
Yes, I see.
You know, if my understanding of their appointment status in each stage.
For those different stages. Yeah, I understand. Is it fair to say that the RIBA stages aren't in practice always strictly separate stages?
In practice? Do you mean C runs into D without a formal moment, or C and D run in parallel?
Yes, both. Could that happen in projects?
I mean, I've worked on projects where they come in very quick succession.
Yeah. But is it your evidence that there always, or commonly, are distinct stages of the project?
There is generally an understanding in the design team that we are in a distinct stage. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you agree that in a design and build arrangement, the stage at which a design and build contractor might vary from possibly quite early, maybe at stage D, or possibly much later stage, perhaps stage F?
Yeah, there's no set rule which of the stages the contractor may be appointed. Yeah,
and I think you yourself in your report acknowledge that sometimes contractors commence on site as early as stage D, albeit not in the case of Grenfell.
Yeah, they may do.
Yeah. For the transcript, that's page 34, paragraph 326 of your report. Could it be said that the RIBA stages are just a framework, and that what's more important in reviewing any project is the substance of who was communicating with whom and when?
I genuinely don't understand that question.
I see. Okay. Going back to this table in your report, can you explain why it's helpful to divide the work into the RIBA stages in this part of your report?
is it helpful? I was just trying to be clear about people's appointment status.
Yeah.
And I'm just struggling to, I don't really understand. I was just trying to be clear about the stages, particularly Ryden, were around on the project.
Yeah.
And my understanding of Exova's appointment status particularly.
Yeah.
And I was also trying to show, and I think it's relevant to some of the evidence from Exova, that not every party was novated to the principal contractor.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, in terms of the scope of work for the Grenfell project, we know it was set by reference to those RIBA stages of work. Is that a common way of setting the fire engineer's scope of work?
Yes,
Do it by reference to those RIBA stages?
If it's a RIBA project, yes,
Yeah.
it's very common. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, if we...
Are we moving away from the table at 3.13?
Yes, I was about to.
Can I just ask a question about that?
Yeah.
We can see from your table, what I think we probably knew anyway, is that Exova were acting for, or under contract to the TMO throughout this period.
In my opinion, yes.
The TMO, some of the witnesses from the TMO gave evidence which might suggest that they weren't aware of that. Have you looked at the, as it were, the communications between Exova and the TMO?
Yeah.
And if so, do you have any comment about them?
Yeah, I heard some of that evidence. I produced a table in my October version of the report, which hopefully we might get to, about who the invoices from Exova were sent to at the TMO, and you might like to look at the names of those persons.
Yeah.
And I would hope that if one was receiving an invoice and approving it for payment, one might understand that one had, one might understand that one had a fire safety engineering company.
Yeah.
And the second piece of information there, in my Exova report, you will see that the KCTMO appointed Exova on other projects on their estate. Yeah. So I will leave that with you.
Well, I just wondered whether you found it surprising or unsurprising that the correspondence between TMO and Exova does not seem to have been either fuller or more designed to make the TMO clear about exactly what the relationship was.
There is correspondence between Paul Dunkerton and Claire Williams with staff at Exova, and there is correspondence from Janice Ray to staff at Exova. Mm. That's what I see.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes,
Thank you. That's helpful. Yeah. We will come back to that invoices table later.
Okay.
If we can look at page 46 of your report, at paragraph 3.5.12. And this is with reference to the Fire Industry Association guide. So when you've assessed the adequacy of the scope of works that were proposed by Exova, you've benchmarked it against the Fire Industry Association guide. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And you've said there that the key point from each of these stages is that at each stage, the fire strategy report is expected to be updated in line with the design information that's current at each stage.
Yes.
So that's one of the key points we get from that. And if we could just look at that Fire Industry Association guide, if we go to paragraph 3.5.9 on page 44, there you've set out for RIBA stage C, now known as stage 2, what the FIA guide says about what should be undertaken at that stage. And I just want to focus on the second paragraph there. It talks about liaising with the client and design team, attend design team meetings, etc., on a basis to be agreed specific to the project requirements.
Yeah.
And we see similar language about stage D in terms of responding to the design documentation and reviewing that.
Yeah.
Now, in the light of that, it's clearly a two-way process, isn't it, as
Yes.
between the design team and the fire engineer?
Yes.
In terms of how the work's progressed. Can you confirm whether in practice it's normal that the party leading the design team, so the lead designer, is the one that leads in designing how much liaison there is with the various consultants, and when and in what form?
That may be a limit set upon you as a fire safety engineer. But where that's not sufficient, I would always make it clear. So for example, if the lead designer said, we want to meet you once in stage C,
Yeah.
and I had assessed their objectives on the project, I might say, I'm afraid I'm concerned that meeting once isn't enough for this project, and we would prefer to have 3 formal meetings or 2 formal meetings.
Yeah.
So again, depending on the project, there may be limits set, or there may be a more open quantity of access proposed.
Yeah.
And the fire safety engineer has to take care that it will be sufficient for their own purposes.
Yeah. Is it also right that the party leading the design team would be, in quotes, in the driving seat when it comes to information being disseminated to the team?
They will be in the driving seat, but a competent fire safety engineer, where they need other information or information at a different time, it's important to ask and to check if that information isn't forthcoming.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, if we just pull up, just so we can remind ourselves of it, the fee proposal for the refurbishment work, EXO 50164. So here we can see it's dated the 9th of May 2012, and you have carefully analysed that fee proposal, haven't you, in your report? Now, just looking at a number of things you've said about this fee proposal, if we could look at page 73 of your report, paragraph 4.3.113, on page 73, you say there that the fee proposal sets out the expectation from Exova that they would be carrying out their work once on an agreed set of building layouts. And you say this is not realistic in the design development phase when layouts change regularly.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, did you find that surprising in a fee proposal for work of this scale, that it said it would be based on one review of an agreed set of building layouts?
Yeah, it's surprising, but it isn't unusual if someone is haggling with you about your fee. Okay, so you might write a fee proposal and say you wanted to review the plans formally 3 or 4 times, and a client may say, I'm not prepared to pay for that.
Yeah.
Where you have this, this opportunity to write your own fee proposal and own scope, I would expect fire safety engineers to take the opportunity to maybe suggest more than one plans review in a stage.
I see. But isn't it possible that there'd be layout changes in the future which might involve significant wasted effort if the fire engineer is reviewing each change of layout? Or would you expect that to be part of the role?
Reviewing each change of layout. Well, if there's, any substantial change in layout impacts the fire safety design and it requires attention, you might agree to do a review, for example, in early stage C, and then a few weeks before the architect wants to submit their report, agree to do another very detailed check towards the end.
Yeah.
Okay. other people might like you to follow them every step of the way, but certainly at the start and, you know, before the stage C drawings are finalised, a detailed review is needed.
Yeah, I see. Now, stage C of the fee proposal, you're critical of Exover's scope of work for RIBA stage C. And if we can look at page 64 and what you say from 4.3.58 and following. So you've compared it with the Fire Industry Association guide. And you say there in the first line, it doesn't address some important items. And I want to pick up what you say next. You say, and in particular, Exover's scope fails to address the most important life safety duty, which was to identify the relevant statutory controls.
Yeah.
This is a serious omission from the scope of works. And you say, instead, their focus was on items that will bring cost impact to the project or would affect a future application under the Building Regulations 2010.
Yeah.
And then you say neither of these are clear about life safety goals, but appear instead to be relevant to commercial consequences for their client only. So that's what you said there. And you also conclude at paragraphs 3.4362, so below then that quote, and following, you say that the scope also doesn't identify a compliance check of the design at stage C. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you say at 4.3.65, if we go at the bottom of that page, you say it's therefore reasonable for me to conclude that life safety was not communicated effectively as the primary consideration within the scope of work for stage C. You see that there?
Yeah.
Now, I just want to take you back to certain parts of the fee proposal. If we go to page 2 of it, so this EXO 50164, page 2, at the top of that page on page 2, so just before you get to RIBA stage C, in the second paragraph under proposed scope of work, it says there the aim of the fire safety work would be to ensure a high standard of fire and life safety for the occupants of the building, whilst highlighting any areas of the building's design that may represent an approvals risk. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And then reading on in that paragraph, it then says, additionally, we will recommend ways to resolve these issues to ensure that the fire and life safety objectives are achieved in the most cost-effective way possible and make sure that the fire strategy does not compromise the architectural concept for the design.
Yeah.
Now, I also want to show you another passage from this fee proposal letter. If we look on page 3 in the final paragraph under stage F, if we could look there. Yes, thank you. There it says, it should be noted that the paramount objective of the building regulations is the life safety of persons within and around the building during a fire and any firefighters attending a fire incident. Property protection is not specifically covered by the building regulations, etc. Now, if we then go back to paragraph 4.3.58 on page 64. This is where you're dealing with stage C. You say, in particular, in the second line, Exover's scope fails to address the most important life safety duty, which was to identify the relevant statutory controls. Now, first, can you give me an example of what you mean by statutory controls there?
Yeah. So can you put their fee proposal back up on the screen then, please?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, as you know, I acknowledge in the other stages that they are very clear about the building regulations in the other stages. This is a review of stage C in isolation.
Yeah.
You've asked me to contemplate it now in your very large question in the round.
Yes, if we bring the fee proposal back up as you want, that's at EXO 50s, yes. And if we go, the stage C part's on page 2, I think, of this. So if we focus on that in the middle of that page. So is what you're saying that you are critical of this particular section of stage C?
Just well, I shouldn't say just, the language there, yes.
I see.
And I'm very clear later on that they do refer to life safety. I I have made that point later in the other stages.
Yes, so that's one of the key points I want to put to you, that do you agree that the passages I've taken you to elsewhere in the letter do expressly refer to the paramount importance of life safety?
Which I've already explained in my report I had seen.
Yeah. But going back to your criticism about it fails to address the most important life safety duty, which was to identify the relevant statutory controls, can we just focus on that point? Why do you say that identifying the statutory controls was perhaps the most important life safety duty relevant to REBA Stage C?
Well, I just see language around cost and approval risk, not language about compliance with, you know, the control mechanism. I don't know where this question has come from, but I think it's overstating the intention of my words. So in that first paragraph, I see an offer to focus on approval risk and cost impact, not compliance.
I see.
That's all I meant.
But there is reference in there to focusing on future issues that would either have an effect under the Building Regulations 2010.
No, it says an effect on a future application under the building regs.
Yes. Wouldn't it be implicit within that those building regulations are part and parcel of providing for life safety? Would that not be implicit?
Yes, it could be implicit. Yes, it could.
Yeah.
But I see the language of approval risk and cost.
Yeah.
And I saw those words more.
I see. Okay. Would it be normal for clients to have their own objectives for any project, like design function, improvements to facilities, appearance and economics?
Yes.
Yeah, and provided that they're always subordinate to the paramount objective of life safety, would you expect consultants to try and accommodate those client objectives?
Yes.
Would you also accept that, subject to life safety being the paramount objective, there's nothing wrong with trying to achieve those objectives in a cost-effective way?
I do agree with that, yes.
And just going back to your words that you'd used in 4.3.59 of your report, you'd said instead their focus was on items that will bring cost impact or affect a future application under the building regulations.
Yes.
Given that Exova state expressly elsewhere in the proposal that their paramount objective is life safety, would you accept that you should perhaps modify that opinion?
I hope that I give my opinion as I go through each stage.
I see.
And I try to be clear at each stage why I'm saying what I'm saying. And then at the end of my review of each strategy, I give a final opinion.
Yeah.
And I hope when we get to stage D and on, you'll see that I acknowledge exactly what Exova said about life safety in those other places.
Yeah. Would you agree that the one, i.e. cost impact, does not necessarily exclude the other, i.e. life safety?
Yeah, can we just go back to the Exova's words? Because these questions reflect a slightly different reading of the situation.
So that's what they said in that. There's their proposal for stage C.
Yeah. Yeah. So what it actually says is the work would focus on issues that would either affect an application or have significant cost impact.
Yeah. So those are the words that you're particularly relying on.
So
there.
I based on things I've seen, I would worry what the meaning of significant cost impact is.
Yeah.
And I think when one is going to raise costs, it's important to then, to state there because I think this is the only stage where they deal with cost impact actually, but we'll move on. It would be important to reflect and remind people that in that work, as you've just asked me, it's cost in conjunction with meeting the life safety goals.
I see.
Okay.
Now, in relation to RIBA stage D/E, which is dealt with at the bottom of that page, you say in your report that the fee proposal doesn't explicitly allow for Exova to review the documentation prepared by other design team members, and you identify that to be a material omission. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we just look at what you say about that at page 66 of your report and paragraph 4.3.74? So you're just dealing with that point. You've set out what the Fire Industry Association states in the paragraph above about reviewing the design documentation provided by others. And then you say this is relevant because the lack of such a review from a competent fire safety engineer increases the chance of the building design breaching the requirements of the fire strategy and therefore the functional requirements with respect to fire safety of the building regulations. How unusual is it in your experience for there to be such an omission in a scope of works which covers RIBA stages D and E?
You're asking me to comment on other people's work, not outside the work I'm doing on Grenfell.
I see.
And I just haven't drawn that into here.
I mean, I think...
So are you asking me that if I think other fire safety consultants, not just Exova, offer to write a strategy without reviewing documentation? I'm afraid to answer the wrong question.
Let's come at it in a different way.
Yeah.
I think you've answered earlier that Fire Industry Association guide was good industry practice at the time. Is that right? So it would be good industry practice to have, as part of the review at stage D, that review of the design documentation. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. So because you have to check that the principles you've agreed during stage C are being transferred and translated in more detail during stage D.
Yeah.
There's more drawings, there's more information, there's more detail. So I think if there was any other fire safety engineering company offered to write a stage D report without reviewing the plans, yes, I would say the same thing.
Yeah, okay. Now, stage F, if we go back to stage F of Exova's fee proposal, this is EXO 50164, this time page 3. Here we can see in the first and second paragraphs, it says, during this stage of work, we would assist the design team and appoint a contractor for the development in addressing the fire safety issues that appeared during the tender review phase. This work is likely to result in further adjustments to the fire safety strategies approved during RIBA stages D and E. This work would ensure that the fire safety strategy for the development followed the requirements of the building regulations. Any agreed revisions to the fire safety strategy would be fully documented and submitted to the Building Control Authority in order to achieve regulatory approval. And then they've set out what the scope of work for that stage would include. And then we see the line, completion of this scope of services will occur once all the above mentioned goals are accomplished. Do you see that there? Mm. And then on fees, in the middle of page 4, if we could go to page 4, in the middle of page 4 we get how the fees are broken down. Mm. We see what's said for RIBA stages C and D and E there. Mm. And then it said this immediately under that. It is proposed that charges for the work carried out during RIBA stage F will be charged at our standard hourly rates. A time basis charge has been proposed during this stage due to the difficulty in determining the extent of work during this stage. Now, do you agree that this document, taken alone, appears to envisage Exova continuing to work on the project after the appointment of the contractor?
Yes.
Just help us as to what might happen to a fire engineer in a design and build situation when a main contractor comes on board. I think, is it right that you said in your report that a number of things could happen at that point?
Yes.
First of all, they could stay client side and carry on being appointed by the client to advise the client. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Or they might be novated to the design and build contractor. Is that right?
Yeah.
Or possibly their work might be terminated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And as I understand it, you have experience of all of those things in,
Yes, I
in
have.
your professional expertise.
Yes.
Now, you've mentioned the fact that this was, you've talked about self-instruction. How commonplace would it have been in your experience for a fire engineer to develop their own scope of works as opposed to have maybe a member of the design team suggesting to them the scope of works at this time?
Oh, the design team suggested.
Well, or another party or the client suggesting a scope of works. How common was it to develop your own scope of work as a fire engineer?
It's common
Yeah.
for certain clients. They, rather than setting out a scope that you are to read and comply with and respond to, you draft up your own scope. So it's perfectly common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And can we now look at what you say at page 70 of your report, paragraph 4.3.95? You say this, you say, additionally, the fee proposal includes no text confirming Exova would wait for specific instructions from their client before proceeding from stage to stage, as more typically occurs on projects. They provide their own requirement to move from stage to stage. Do you see that there?
No, where are you reading from?
Oh, sorry, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. 4.3.95.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
So you say the fee
Yeah.
proposal includes
Yes,
no
that's
text
right.
confirming they'd wait for specific instructions before
Yeah.
proceeding from stage to stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, can you just help us with that? Just to be clear, are you saying, based on your own experience, that it would be typical for a fire engineer's scope of works to expressly state
Yeah.
that the fire engineer should wait for instructions from the client before proceeding from stage to stage?
Yeah, I think, again, this is more commercial risk management rather than technical risk management. So when you finished your, when you write your fee proposal, you would say, review the plans X number of times, attend X number of meetings, and when we have agreed our report is a final stage D report, we would exchange some kind of communication to agree D was completed and E was to start. Because sometimes a project may go on hold between D and E, for example, or the architect may say, we would like you to hold for 2 months and then we would like you to commence your stage E works. So we manage our commercial risk by reaching those agreements explicitly before we move on. We don't just keep going.
Yeah, I understand. In reality, isn't it the case that the decision to move from one RIBA stage to the next rests with the ultimate client?
In reality, rests with the client. Do you mean that? I'm sorry. Again, I just don't understand that question, because if I've agreed with the architect and they're representing the client that it's time that we move to stage E,
Yeah,
that is reality.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, Regulation 38 now on
Yeah.
the fee proposal. If you go to page 72, if we go to page 72 of your report, paragraph 4.3.108, this is in the context of a discussion about Regulation 38, and you
Yeah.
say this there, omitting this from the part of their scope of works specifically identified as being in support of the principal contractor was a major omission.
Yeah.
This is because the principal contractor needed to comply with Regulation 38 at Grenfell Tower,
Yeah.
not just Schedule 1, Part B, I think that's of the building regulations.
Yeah.
And the fire strategy needed to make the additional requirements to comply clear at this stage F.
Yeah.
Now, we know that Regulation 38 of the building regulations, we've got a whole separate report from you on that, deals with the handing over of fire safety information by the person carrying out the works. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's right that that would include the fire safety information relating to the design and construction of the building and the services, its fittings and equipment that will assist with the safe operation and management of the building.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that had to be handed over no later than the completion of the work. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
And so would that correspond with RIBA stage K, completion of the work?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah. Why do you consider that it would have been reasonable to have expected Exova to address Regulation 38 when any handover would due to be at the end of the project?
So I think as a reputable fire safety engineering company, they should raise the duty for others to comply with Regulation 38. Regardless of when that's going to happen. I think your question might be about timing.
Yes.
So I'm being clear that the fire safety engineer must make the parties aware of their duty to comply with Regulation 38.
Yeah.
And when you're writing a fee proposal, particularly where you're offering to assist the contractor, I would expect a fire safety engineer to make clear that's a looming issue for them.
Yeah.
It's nothing more than that.
I see. Yeah. So even though Exova's fee proposal only goes to stage F, you still maintain that that was a material omission, not to mention Regulation 38.
So my reading of the English under stage F is that it doesn't actually align with what happens in stage F. It actually appears to be more like a stage K set of activities.
I see.
And at that, if one is advising any contractor, beyond stage E, it's important to raise this looming issue for them.
Yes. I see. And does the fact that there was no specific request for help from Exova about Regulation 38 at any stage, does that affect your opinion about whether or not you think it was implicit that they ought to deal with that?
So helping to comply with Regulation 38 and raising it as a compliance issue are two very different things. So the fire safety engineer would only have some specific pieces of information relevant to Regulation 38.
I see.
So I'm not hoping that the readers of this text think I'm saying that Exova had the responsibility to fully comply with Regulation 38, because that's not what I mean. They had a duty to raise it because together with Part B, they were the relevant fire safety compliance objectives.
Yeah.
It relies on a lot of other people to get to that state.
Yeah. Now, level of fees in the refurbishment proposal.
Yeah.
At page 74 of your report, if we go to that, paragraph 4.3.122, you've said there, you've analysed the fees, you've broken down those fees based on the hourly rates that Exova were charging at the time.
Yeah.
And you've concluded that they were, in your opinion, wholly inadequate to provide sufficient resources for the primary refurbishment project, but particularly allowed very little time to produce a detailed fire strategy for the purposes of achieving statutory approval as they offered in their scope of works.
Yeah.
Now, you said the fees were wholly inadequate.
Yeah.
I mean, can you give us an approximate ballpark estimate of what the fees ought to have been? We know that they were 3,300 for stage C and 5,300 for stage DE.
And sorry, how many days work approximately was
So that
5,000?
that broke down into around 4 days of Mr. Ashton's time at stage C, and around 6.5 to 7 days of his time at stages D and E. So if it's easier in time, you could tell us how long.
So, it's not from, I don't actually, okay. So I think that to do a detailed fire safety strategy for a building like Grenfell Tower, which had, as far as I'm concerned, it actually had quite a lot of complexity. I've heard others say that it was a simple building. I don't actually think that it was. I would expect with the meetings, the exchanges by email, reviewing even one set of architectural drawings very thoroughly, and then setting out the level of detail required in a Stage E report. Just for Stage E, I would expect it to be maybe 10 plus days. That's at E.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I now want to look at each of the outline fire safety strategies that were produced for the refurbishment. Let's go to issue 1, dated the 31st of October 2012. That's EXO 50519. We can see the date there on the first page, and if we go to the second page, we can see it's prepared by Mr. Ashton and reviewed by Mr. McElhaney there. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And then we see on page 4 that we get a description of the refurbishment in the introduction,
Yeah.
which sets out what the refurbishment comprises. But as Mr. Ashton accepted, although he knew that the building was to be overclad at this point, he omitted overcladding from this description of the refurbishment works. Now, I just want to look at what you've said about this in your report. If we go to page 187 and look paragraph 6.5.5. So you say it fails to identify if it applies to the whole building or only those parts which form part of Exover's understanding of the refurb works. You say the 4 drawings that he refers to in issue 1 provide proposed floor plans for all levels of Grenfell Tower except basement. And then you say in the next paragraph, however, it does describe the existing single stair serving level 4 and above, as well as the existing smoke control ventilation. Further, it makes provision for emergency lighting and the performance criteria for new wall and ceiling linings, but not limited to just the lower 4 levels. So I think what you're saying there is the content of what it's dealing with is more than just the lower floors. It's dealing with the entire building.
It advice in certain parts of the report, if you want, strays into other levels,
Yeah.
or seems to
Yeah,
refer to other levels. But that's why it's important in an existing building being refurbished. One of the first things you would explain is where you're going to rely on the existing physical condition, where new things are being done, old things are being removed. It's a very important kind of boundary or basis to explain what your advice is based on.
yeah,
Because it's a mix of things,
yeah,
and a mix of locations, and that clarity is important
yeah.
throughout.
Yeah. Now, if we keep going down within this section of your report, 6.5.7, we'll come back to this in a moment, exactly what it said about the entire overcladding of the external walls. And then you say 658, it communicated information related to the entire building, not just the first floor levels, listed in the description of the refurbishment.
Yeah.
Exover did not provide a set of fire strategy drawings to accompany issue 1 of the outline fire safety strategy, nor was a marked up set of drawings by others provided in the report.
Yeah.
And again, would that be something that you would expect of a reasonably competent fire engineer at this time, to provide a set of fire strategy drawings accompanying that report?
Yeah, so some people do their own drawings, you know, they take the basic CAD and do their own. And then some of us mark up someone else's set of plans to reflect our advice. So either what's required or something that isn't quite working, something that's missing. And it's part of that exchange amongst the professionals.
Yeah. And just to be clear, do you think it fell below the standards of a reasonably competent fire engineer not to include those kind of marked up drawings?
Yeah, because it's very hard, you know, as you can see, you can write the English that was written, say, describing the project. Now we can judge that. But if there was a set of plans of every floor at Grenfell Tower, just marking up where the advice is being given, then that's very clear, isn't it? There's no retrospective judgment can be passed because you set it out very carefully floor by floor.
Yeah. And then finally then at 6.5.10, you say critically, Exova fails to identify that overcladding the entire building is a part of the definition of the refurbishment works in their report.
Yeah.
But of more grave concern is that they still go on to provide their advice, and we're going to come to that in a moment. So that's what you say about some critical omissions from the report. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, if we go back to the report itself and look at page 5, so EXO 5 zeros, yeah. And here we can see at 2.1 we get a very high overview of the building regulations 2010, and then I want to look at what's said about B3 at pages 7 to 8. We can see B3 there, and that goes over into the next page. There's the end of B3 at the top there, and then into B4. This is just to remind everybody what we actually see in this report on B3 and B4. And then we've got that familiar phrase under B4, it is considered that the proposed changes will have no adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire spread, but this will be confirmed by an analysis in a future issue of this report. Now, you've set out your views about the contents of the report in detail, in considerable detail, in your expert report, and I'm not going to take you through all of that now. At section 6.5, pages 187 to 189, you summarise your review of that fire safety report. I want to pick it up on page 187, paragraph 6.5.10. So we were just looking at that, fails to identify the overcladding as a part of the refurbishment works. And if we go over the page, you say the grave concern is that they still go on to provide their advice that this part of the works would have no adverse effect. Then you say in the next paragraph, yet the records show the staff at Exova had never analysed the external wall construction proposals, and so were not in any position to make this statement. I provide more detailed evidence in section 9. And then you say, therefore, I conclude this was very serious evidence of professional negligence from my perspective as a practising fire engineer. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, do those conclusions remain your view, having heard the oral evidence, including of Mr. Ashton?
Yes.
Then I want to pick it up at 6.5.17 on that same page further down. You say this, specific to functional requirement B4, external fire spread, Exova provided no guidance or performance criteria for the external wall construction. And then you say, thus, no performance standard was defined which the design team could rely upon, nor did Exova indicate to the design team that the fire performance of the external wall construction was of any importance. And then you say this, therefore, Exova's report is not the creation of a detailed fire strategy for the proposed development, which will be written in line with the requirements of the building regulations, as their RIBA Stage D scope allowed. By reference to my analysis in Table 6.15, the FIA guide for RIBA Stage C and their own scope, issue 1 of the outline fire safety strategy that was issued at the very end of Stage C did not contain the level of information required for an RIBA Stage C fire safety strategy. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, just pausing there, in circumstances where Exova did not have much information at all about the nature of the overcladding prior to writing this report, and if we can just put aside for a moment the Stage C report, which they were copied into on the same day that this report was sent. So I'm going to take you to the RIBA Stage C report in a moment, so leave that aside. What would you expect a reasonably competent fire engineer to say about the B4 requirement in that first report?
So So first of all, to know the building was being overclad,
Yeah.
and then to set out as an absolute bare minimum the statutory guidance for insulation, cavity barriers, and the external surface. With no, if you're given no drawings whatsoever about the overcladding, and that has happened many times, the best thing left for you to do professionally is to simply state the statutory guidance minimum requirements.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah.
And what would you say to the point that, well, the architect, it's a similar point to the one we talked about earlier, the architect can read approved document B for themselves. Is it that difficult for the architect to look at that guidance and apply it themselves?
I'm not meant to be putting my
what's your answer
grumpy, glary face on. So it's got nothing to do with what the architect can read or not. I just honestly don't even understand why that's being drawn in. The fire safety engineer is responsible for their work and communicating what they say they're going to do in their fee proposal. And it's not for any architect to try to decipher, infer, read around, work out exactly what another professional person means. Okay? So the very, very basic thing you can do, either in the absence of information, or maybe you don't understand cladding drawings because you don't feel competent to read them, is to simply state, make sure you understand the external surface is X, insulation is Y, cavity barriers are required here. At least then the other professionals can read that and hopefully decide to do their job too.
Yeah. And just to be clear, on cavity barriers, would you be saying they're required around openings as well as elsewhere in your external wall? Would you make that clear?
I would, so I would, but as a bare minimum, refer to the section in approved document B. Even if you're going to say nothing else,
Yeah.
at least direct the reader to the section and say, you need to work this out.
Yeah. And on the external wall, section 12 of ADB,
Yes.
would you be referring them to 12.5 of ADB and the different routes that ADB suggests in 12.5 to comply?
In 2012,
Yes.
I may not I may not have got into all the different routes of compliance.
Yeah.
Okay, but like I said, just as an absolute bare minimum, making clear the performance of each of the components, even just that, is better than nothing.
Yeah.
Now, just help me with this if you can.
Yeah.
My recollection is that Mr. Ashton told us that he hadn't been given any information about the proposals for overcladding.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether in those circumstances you would find it acceptable for the fire engineer to put in the report, I haven't got any information, I will deal with this later on when I get it.
Yes.
Just that, without any reference to
Yes.
the ADB requirements and so on.
Yes, I agree with that, because at least that's a warning sign. Okay, I don't have any information, I need information, and then I will give you some advice.
Well, now what happened in this case was that a provisional view was expressed that it wouldn't affect B4, or the requirements of B4, but to be confirmed in a later report. Was that
I don't
not
understand.
acceptable?
I don't understand how you can give a view if you haven't seen any information.
But at least it's making it clear that the view you are giving is only provisional.
Can we
Let's
just
go back
put
to the-
up, just
Perhaps we
put
better
up
look at
his,
Go back to the
put up
words
his
he
sentence.
uses. If we go back to
Yeah.
EXO 50519 and look at page 8.
That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think it's important to bring in here the other part of B4, which is to do with fire spread between buildings. And it was very common to do numerical, to do analysis for that part.
And that's space separation.
Space separation.
That's dealt with in section 13 of ADB.
Yeah.
Is that
Now,
right?
I can imagine if you had a quick look at the site layout, saw where Grenfell Tower was located, I can imagine writing then the proposed changes will have no adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire spread, because that is external fire spread.
Yeah.
So you're happy that things look sufficiently far away that you're not worried. I don't agree that without understanding overcladding, that you could immediately assume it would have no adverse effect without information for that part of B4.
So effectively, you're saying this comment deals with space separation under B4, but is completely silent about spread of flame over surface.
So
Is that the point?
that is so. Mr. Ashton has to speak for himself. My experience and the focus at that time of professionals was very much on space separation and those calculations. Those calculations were very common and getting more advanced as well. So based on my experience and just reading it this way, I would immediately assume it was about space separation, not about section 12.
Spread of flame over the surface.
Spread of flame through the external wall construction.
Yeah.
That's what I would say based on my experience of many years.
Right. So you would read this as we've just discussed,
Yeah.
dealing with space separation
Yes.
rather than spread
Yes,
of flame
I
over the
would.
surface.
Yes.
And that would mean that this paragraph says nothing about spread of flame over surface.
If that, yes, that would be correct.
And is that a serious omission, or is it just, neutral? I asked because you're quite critical about this passage, and I think we need to understand.
I am. Okay, because I think it is a serious omission, because in an overcladding project, in any overcladding project, you're adding materials to an existing building. And so what those materials will do in a fire for both the rules, if you will, section 12 and section 13, are, can I say, equally important? One is not more important than the other. Both must be looked at.
All right.
Okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, that's really helpful. Yes, thank you. Now, the Stage C report, the RIBA Stage C report, you've noted in your report that on the same day that Exova sent its issue 1 of the outline fire safety strategy, they sent that on the afternoon. In fact, earlier that day at 11:38 in the morning, Exova had been copied in on an email sending a link to the Studio E Stage C report. And what I want to do is just go to that email where Mr. Ashton's copied in. That's at EXO 401575. And it's the second email down on this page. So it's from Adrian Jess at Studio E. It's sent to David Hale, Alan Dawson at Appleyards, and then Mark Anderson, Paul Dunkerton of the TMO, and CC'd into it are a number of other professionals, including Chris Churchman, that's the landscape architects, Andrew McQuat, Max Fordham, others from Max Fordham, Curtains, the structural engineers, Tweechin Lim from Artelia, Terry Ashton, Exova, someone from Syntegra, Mark Watterson, Taylor Young, that's the planning consultants. And Adrian Jess says, please find attached the Studio E FTP location for the Stage C report. So a link is being sent to the Studio E Stage C report. And then he asks a couple of individuals some questions below. You can see he asks Mark, I think that's Mark Anderson, and then David Allen Mark, he asks, and if we could just go over the next page just to see the end of that email. And he asks those individuals, can you give me a steer? Okay. So he's copied into that email. Action points are identified for others. No action points are identified in the text of the email for Exova. Now, in spite of that, would you expect a reasonably competent fire engineer to download and read that Stage C report if sent this email?
Can you just go back to the main page, please?
Yeah.
So if my Stage C report wasn't finished as it should have been, and it should have been included within the main Stage C report, that's the normal practice.
You mean Exova's own Stage C report?
So
Yes.
I'm trying to not be...
Yeah.
So Exova were responsible for producing the Stage C fire strategy.
Yeah.
It should have been ready on time, coordinated and issued with all the other Stage C reports. That is normal, bare minimum professional practice.
Yeah.
If for some reason they were running late
Yeah.
and they received everyone else's Stage C report, would I expect them? I would hope that they would check it to see if there was any other information they needed to finalise their report.
Yeah.
If they didn't do that, when they went to start their next level of reporting,
Yes.
I would absolutely be of the view they needed to open the link then.
Yes. So just to be clear, at some point on this project, whether that day
Or
if
later.
not possible later, you are clear that a reasonably competent fire engineer
Yes.
would read that Stage C report in full.
Yeah, in full, or do a word search for relevant fire safety points if you don't want to read the whole thing, but look at it to understand what the point of the project is and what the proposals from all the other professionals are, because they impact the advice you're giving. And you said there was no actions for Exova. If the Stage C report is acceptable, can you please sign off on the current layouts? We would note that coordination work on Stage D is likely to be limited until Stage C layouts have been approved. If I read that, I now know I'm entering Stage D.
Yeah.
And it's time. Exova have their scope of work. They've set out what they're going to do. That is their signal that once these plans are approved, it's time to move to the next level of detail as well. So that email is important for two reasons.
I see. Does the absence of any direct instruction for Exova to review and analyse this report affect what you would have expected of Exova?
No.
And just to be clear, you're aware that they're only CC'd into this email? Yes.
It makes no difference whatsoever. There's other people CC'd too.
Now, Stage C, we know, is the concept stage within the RIBA stages. Would it be fair to say that at that point, proposals are often at a high-level stage?
Yeah, by definition, yeah.
And would you expect that Stage C report and information might be subject to change?
Absolutely. That's why you have to coordinate the whole way through all the stages.
Yeah. Would it be reasonable to expect Exova to analyse the information in the Stage C report, given that the information might later change?
They needed to analyse the information in the report to make sure their own work was accurate.
Yeah. Now, can we look at that Stage C report now? This is MAX 50445. And it was a report that was substantial. It was 186 pages in its entirety.
Yeah.
In your opinion, should a reasonably competent fire engineer have been able to find their way around such a document to be able to extract the key information they needed to be aware of?
Yes. Are we allowed to put the table of contents up instead, or?
Yes. I mean, I was going to take you to a number of key things within it.
Okay, sorry.
perhaps if I can do that, and then we can always go back to the table of contents if you need it. If we can start on page 27. So that Stage C report included a section on the overcladding proposals.
Yeah.
And that was headed Design Approach Overcladding. And then over on page 28,
Yeah.
it said in the middle of that page that at that point it was a zinc composite rain screen cladding is proposed to the upper levels.
Yeah.
Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And we've got a number of images, and then
Yeah.
the advantages of zinc are set out.
Yeah.
If we go to page 31, we can see that we have plan sections on that page showing overcladding, incorporating composite zinc cladding, and a section at the side, yes?
Yeah.
And at the bottom. And then at 32, page 32, we can see at the top, that isometric sketch at the top is showing that there's going to be insulation behind the rain screen cladding as one of the layers that's going onto the building, yes?
Yes.
And various cladding options are also considered at the bottom of that page. If we go out, including, we see rain screen zinc on the right-hand side, but we've also got rain screen aluminium there towards the middle of the page.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Yeah.
And then on page 82, so later in the report, it incorporates the Max Fordham Stage C report. And at the heading 4.0, we've got a heading for insulation.
Yeah.
And on that page, you see the insulation is named in that table on the right-hand side, insulation new Celotex FR5000.
Yeah.
So we actually know here, although we don't know the exact product in terms of zinc, rain screen or other type of rain screen, we do have a product for the insulation, yes?
Yes.
And indeed on the next page, page 83, under the heading glazing infill panels, we've got the Celotex insulation mentioned again,
Yeah.
in fact twice there.
Yeah.
Now I've taken you to those parts of the report where we see information about the overcladding. Would you have expected a reasonably competent fire engineer to have picked out all that information from this report?
I think the minimum I would expect a fire engineer in that year to notice was some type of surface, some type of insulation being applied on every story, and nothing further.
Okay, I see. Do you agree that this Stage C report makes clear the scope of the refurbishment project, including the extent of the proposed works to insulate and overclad the building?
Yes, so I think that's where you realise the scale of the overcladding as a minimum.
Yeah. Do you agree that it also contains some specific information about what was proposed, including the specific type of insulation and possible outer cladding options?
Yes.
Should that information have fed directly into the B3 and B4 analysis that Exova then did in the fire safety strategies?
So once by detailed fire safety strategy stage, by the time they came to do the detailed fire safety strategy, I'm not sure what you're asking. I think, again, the minimum would have been the building is being overclad on every story. Some materials are fixed, some materials are not yet fixed.
Yeah.
Here are the performances.
Yeah.
Is a minimum. Before the Grenfell fire.
Yeah.
No, I would not have expected them to take any further step regarding satisfying themselves about products.
I see.
Absolutely clear on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But recognising the scale and that it's a surface and insulation,
Yeah.
I would expect all of us and Exova to recognise then.
Yeah. Now, at the point that they get the Stage C report, they're just about to issue one of their outline fire safety strategy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't look like anyone comes back to them and says, oh, by the way, we've done our Stage C report. Can you now produce a new version in the light of what the other reports say? Does that make a difference to your opinion, that they weren't asked immediately to go back and have another go?
Sorry, when is it that, do you mean that day when they're...
Yes, nothing comes. When Exova then later that day send their report,
Yeah.
Nobody comes back to them in the following few days and says, well, hang on a minute, we've now done our Stage C report. You obviously haven't taken it into account. Please now do that.
I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, on the project. So all I can say is I don't understand why the fire strategy went out after everybody else's information. And equally, I don't understand why that wasn't raised by anybody else. So I can't offer anything else.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I think that's a good moment for a break.
Good idea, yes. We're going to take a break now, Dr. Lane, so we'll come back at 25 to 4, please.
Yes.
And usual injunction, no talking about your evidence while you're away, please.
Okay,
Thanks so much. Right, 25 to 4, please. Okay. Would you ask Dr. Lane to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, ready to carry on again?
Yes, I am.
Good,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange?
Yes, thank you. Now, you've mentioned a couple of times that a question about the timing of Exover's work, given when its first issue of its outline strategy is arriving compared with the Stage C report. Can we just look at what you say about that in your written report? If we go to page 100, paragraph 4.7.97. You say, as I identify in Table 4.3, Max Fordham first issued their Stage C report to the design team for comment on the 9th of September, this is 2012, with the final issue of that report occurring on the 10th of October 2012. As Exover did not issue their Stage C report until substantially after the others in the design team, there was no time provided for other consultants on the design team to adequately understand the implications of the fire strategy on their own design works before all of the Stage C reports were issued. And then you say, additionally, the Stage C report that was issued by Studio E on the 31st of October 2012 was disclosed by Max Fordham, and then you give the references. This report contains the Stage C reports of Max Fordham, Studio E and Curtains. The formal Stage C report only contains the design note issued by Exover on the 12th of September 2012. As I make clear in Section 6, this initial design note was issued as an interim measure by Exover and knowingly only addresses parts B1 and B5. It is silent on parts B2 to B4. And then you say, therefore, Exover issued their Stage C information too late for it to be incorporated into the formal reporting package for RIBA Stage C for the primary refurbishment project. So that's your written evidence on that. Can you just expand on why it's so important for any work on the fire strategy to be delivered in good time to allow others to digest that work?
Because it impacts their decision making and the detailing, the work that they have to do, and they need to understand the basic objectives of the fire safety strategy, and then their design enable the Max Fordham, Studio E, everyone, their proposals has to enable that. And that's why it's good practice to have the fire safety strategy reports out earlier so everyone can coordinate, understand, critique, comment, go back and look at their own work. And the fire safety engineer maybe have to go back and make some changes too.
Yes, I follow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, issue 2 of the outline fire safety strategy comes almost a year later, on the 24th of October 2013. And I now want to move forward to look at that. And just in terms of what had happened by that stage, we know that in August 2013, Studio E issued their Stage D RIBA report, Stage D being design development of the RIBA stages. But what we see is that when that report is issued, Exover are not even copied into that email. So they're not, as far as we can tell on the documents, they're never either directly sent or indirectly sent a copy of the Stage D report. Mm-hmm. Now, in those circumstances, in circumstances where Exover were not sent the Stage D report by Studio E, would you expect Exover to request that report from Studio E or from its client, the TMO?
Once they started their work again and started to prepare their next version of the fire safety strategy, I would expect them to ask what information was now available and what stage the design, how developed the design was. And I'd imagine the quick reply would be, please read the Stage D report, and then we'll have a discussion about what's needed next.
And just to be clear, would you expect a reasonably competent fire engineer to ask for and then read the Stage D report?
I would expect them to ask for it if they didn't have it and they were about to start a Stage E fire safety strategy, and to use it as a reference guide. So go in and check the sections that were relevant.
Yeah. And if you'd not been provided with certain information that you felt you needed in order to prepare the next iteration of a fire safety strategy, what would you have reasonably expected a fire safety engineer to do?
Yeah. To ask for the information they needed.
And how proactive would you expect a reasonably competent fire safety engineer to be in getting hold of the information that it needed for its fire strategy reports?
How proactive? Reasonably proactive. You know, if when Studio E contacted them for the next version of the fire safety strategy, the stage D report had gone out. I don't have all my dates written in front of me here, but the stage D report had gone out, so they were in stage E. So if I'm contacted in stage E, it's detailed fire safety strategy time. So I need to know where the proposals are becoming final and the level of detail being finalised by all the other professionals. So I can factor that into the advice I'm going to give,
Yeah.
and what I'm going to record in the detailed fire safety strategy.
Yeah.
So you have to be as proactive as you need to be to get the information that you require.
Yeah. Now, we heard from a number of times during Mr. Ashton's oral evidence that he was assuming that if he had to consider something, he was expecting a direct request of him by the architects to get him to look at a particular aspect of the works. Now, is that your opinion of how a reasonably competent fire engineer should operate on a project like this?
No.
Can you help us as to why that approach,
So-
in your view, isn't good enough?
So the evidence shows that Mr. Ashton answered questions when he was asked.
Yeah.
If your scope of work is to produce a detailed fire safety strategy, the only way you can do that is to ask for drawings, ask for information, talk to other people about where their proposals are.
Yeah. And would you expect that a fire safety engineer might need to educate other members of the team about exactly what information they would need on a project?
Well, I don't know about they can educate if they want, but they need to be clear of what they need and why, so the other professionals can help them. But this team, Max Fordham, Studio E particularly, have experience in REBA stages and the information needed.
Right.
Yeah.
Now let's go to the outline fire safety strategy issue number 2. This is EXO 50430. And we can see there it's dated the 24th of October 2013, and we can see on page 2 that Mr. Ashton has prepared it, and this time Dr. Tony Pearson has reviewed it. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then page 4, we see from the introduction, there's still no reference to the overcladding in this description. And just to be clear, is it your evidence that certainly by this time, well, I think you said it by the first iteration, but that in this iteration, overcladding should have been mentioned at this point?
This was an overcladding project.
Yeah.
So the fire safety engineer needed to record that in their reports.
And then what we see on page 8, where we see the B3 and the B4 sections together, is that these sections were both unchanged.
Yes.
A year later. And it contains exactly the same statement there for B4 under 3.1.4. Now, can you help us? In your view, how should Exova have addressed the B4 issue if they felt they still had limited information as to the proposed changes to the exterior?
Yeah. So if they had checked the Stage C report, they knew the overcladding was extensive, so just scale. And now we're into detailed fire safety strategy time, which means it's where it could be the final record of the detailed design proposals by the design team. So as an absolute bare minimum, I would expect to see now, there's two parts of B4, remember. So space separation dealt with analysis if needed, with a drawing. And section 12 regarding the construction of the external wall, bare minimum writing down the minimum performance requirements for each of the layers. So that's bare minimum, not bringing in any post-Grenfell levels of detail.
I see. But we know that by this time, if they've read the Stage C report,
Yeah.
they're aware of the proposed insulation.
Yes.
Would you expect any kind of analysis of materials by this stage?
So in that year, we're in 2013 now, I don't know what analysis of the materials is implied by the English there, okay? It would be, I'm not going to say I think they should have automatically read up about Celotex, because I know that wasn't very common practice at the time, okay? That's why I'm just keeping on saying, writing down the recommendations or the requirements in approved document B is the bare minimum.
Yeah. And just to be clear, would that have flagged up clearly that under 12.7 of approved document B, any insulation material
Yes.
needed to be of limited combustibility?
Yes, that's correct. So just that statement is the minimum piece of professional guidance I would expect written down in the fire strategy.
If the fire engineer had seen from the Stage C or Stage D report that the insulation proposed was Celotex,
Yeah.
you say he couldn't be expected to investigate the properties of Celotex.
Yeah,
Well, then who would one expect
Yeah.
to investigate the properties of Celotex if not the fire engineer?
Yeah, so I don't want to say couldn't be expected. I said I can imagine it not happening.
Well, I think we
Okay.
have to understand
Yeah.
that whether something could or couldn't have been expected
Yeah,
means whether a reasonably competent person
Yeah.
in that position would have done something. So the question is whether a reasonably competent fire engineer would first have noticed the proposed use of Celotex, and secondly would have taken the trouble to find out what were the properties of Celotex.
yeah. By 2013,
Yes.
there was sufficient concern in the profession about the description of insulation being categorised as class naught rather than being required to be material of limited combustibility. The minimum I'd expect is that written down, and if one had noticed Celotex in the Stage C report, it would have been an extra step at that time to explore what that meant. Some professionals would have done it, some professionals would not.
And when you refer, I'm sorry to press on this, but
No,
when
it's
you
okay.
refer to some professionals, in each case, do you mean some reasonably competent professionals would and some reasonably competent professionals would not?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Although I have to say that still leaves me wondering who could be expected to do that.
Well, at the moment, I'm giving my advice in 2013 and they're doing their report. Later, when a very specific matter arises around the data sheet and the cavity barriers, I will give you a different opinion.
Yeah, so I
Thank
think
you.
you're talking there about when in September 2014,
Yeah.
Mr. Ashton is asked
Yeah.
questions
Yeah.
and sent the Celotex data sheet.
So I will. You will hear me say different things. So I'm just trying to live in the moment.
Yes, that's right.
As a professional at that time. All I think is fair to say is that they would set out the performance requirements, and then others would have given a view on any product, including Celotex, and other chartered fire engineers or competent professionals would not at this stage.
Yeah. And I think what you're describing is that what you reasonably expect from fire engineers at this time is evolving
Exactly.
as knowledge is evolving
Exactly.
over these years.
Yeah, because things are now changing rapidly in the background.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's why I don't want to bring future events to here.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about anything after Grenfell. So in the background, things are changing rapidly. There's some major fires.
Yeah.
There's known concern in the industry about how insulation is being categorised and discussed, and things are changing.
Yes. Is one of those changes BR 135 third edition, which has a number of warnings in it, for example, about the proliferation of combustible materials being used on high-rise buildings?
What date is the third edition?
2013.
Yeah, exactly. So then, but I'm not sure that was the first time. Sorry, I'd need to get them all out if I was in the office. But I think that was always quite clear, wasn't it? The other versions?
There's a very specific warning in the third edition that a lot of new materials are coming onto the market that are combustible and need particular care.
Yes, and I think, you know, for a top tier consultancy such as Exova, and also the very unique and specialised experience their company had around testing, I have to assume they too were aware of how rapidly things were changing around us at that time. It was a very complex time, 2013, 14, 15.
Yeah. And you referred that background in terms of what was making people much more aware of the dangers.
Yeah.
You've referred to other cladding fires. Were those international cladding fires or domestic ones?
I think I wish I had all my dates, but I think I'm mostly thinking about international fires, I have to say.
Yeah. And anything else that sticks out for you in terms of why people were becoming more aware at this point of this issue?
Anything else? There were lots of overcladding projects.
Yeah.
And there was other drivers to use insulation on new build projects. And my experiences in quite frequently in 2013 was this whole issue of contractors and other parties almost, you know, beseeching me, saying, but this document says it's class naught and therefore it's acceptable. And I was involved in very many conversations, even on our own projects at Arup, trying to explain the performance of insulation. Okay. So that was the backdrop. I'm still not going to say the bare minimum from Mr. Ashton was to take out the Celotex brochure, get some reports. I'm still not going to say that at this moment in time.
Yeah, I understand. Now, if we just look at page 341 of your report, paragraph 14.1.75 and following, you say there it was Exova's primary failing to have omitted B41 and to have said that this will be confirmed by an analysis in a future issue of this report without ever returning to that topic. Then you say, but it is also important to acknowledge that no member of the design team or the statutory authorities raised any concerns about the information missing in the fire strategy regarding B4, nor indeed did they identify any other aspect of the missing information to support Schedule 1 Part B, either when they were provided with the fire strategy or at any other time. So you make those points clear there.
Yes.
Now, I just want to take you to a number of points made in Exova's opening submissions. Some of them are topics we've touched on already, but I want to put them directly to you so you can respond. If we go to Exova's opening, this is EXO 401774. And I want to look at page 12 to start with. In paragraph 4.3, it said there that the building regulations and approved document B and the basic approach they take are the bread and butter of the British construction industry. Construction companies need no specialist advice to be aware of them. nor likewise do those involved in designing cladding systems need to be pointed towards the provisions relevant specifically to external fire spread. So I touched on this point earlier with you, but I wanted you to see, and we'll take you to another few paragraphs about how this type of point is put by Exova. What is your response to that as a justification for why spelling out the performance requirements would have been pointless?
It's no justification in my mind, because Exova wrote a scope of work, offered a detailed fire safety strategy, were appointed to do so, and B4 is one of 5 significant requirements, and it required information to be provided. I don't understand who gets to decide which parts of the building regulations are so either irrelevant or well known by others. You don't even need to mention them in a detailed fire safety strategy. So I don't agree that that is a valid justification whatsoever.
And then if we go on to page 30 of this document, at paragraph 6.3, A and B, and again, this is about directly in response to your criticism that the report ought to have set out the required performance to comply with B4. They make the point in A that the audience for Exova's advice comprised expert architects who evidently ought to have been familiar with the requirements of the building regulations and ADB, and who evidently considered they had sufficient expertise to set out detailed provisions in the employer's requirements without seeking further specialist input. Now, I've already touched on that point with you about architects, but what is your response?
I'm very sorry to read something like that, I have to say, because it isn't an acceptable enough reason as to why nothing at all was written about either part of B4 in a competent fire safety engineering company's fire safety strategy. And I will just be saying the same thing over and over again.
And B, they say that another person who might have referred to Exova's advice later was an experienced design and build contractor and a specialist cladding contractor, Harley, neither of whom will have needed simply to be pointed to the building regulations.
Yeah. Again, as the evidence shows, that was also incorrect.
Yeah.
Because Harley asked some questions later, and they needed to be answered, and they were not.
Yeah. And in your experience at the time, did organisations like Ryden or specialist cladding contractors like Harley or similar, did they require advice from fire engineers to help them understand, for example, Section 12 of ADB as it applied to their project? Did you have experience of that?
My experience is that principal contractors and specialist cladding contractors needed assistance in understanding what the fire safety requirements were when they were going on to do their part of the job, which is, the really detailed piece of work about materials, how they're pieced together, their location. So it is my experience that they needed some help, and I think,
Yeah. And then if we can look at paragraph 6.3b, sorry, that is this. Yes, within this paragraph, they then say, if all that Exova was required to do for this audience was to remind or repeat the performance requirements set out in the building regulations, of which they were individually and collectively well aware, then such a requirement was redundant. Now, just breaking that down, it will be a matter for the chairman and the panel to consider whether or not those organisations, in fact, were individually and collectively well aware of the requirements of the building regulations. But what's your response to whether it would be redundant?
Yeah, I mean, if all the professionals on the design team were well aware of the building regulations, it doesn't kind of counterbalance or remove the duty Exova had when they offered a detailed fire safety strategy, and so a detailed fire safety strategy needed to be provided. And I would like if we can come back to these points here
Yeah.
when we've got to the end of my evidence
Yeah.
about what happened in 2014 and 2015, I think, and the guidance that was given to Ryden and Harley.
Okay, I understand. Now, you've touched on the state of knowledge at this time.
Yeah.
We've been discussing that, about the state of a reasonably competent fire engineer's knowledge of this time. Would you have expected a reasonably competent fire engineer to have been aware of international cladding fires at the time they were working on the Grenfell project?
Yes, I would, and particularly a company like Exova, who operate in different countries and have testing labs, as I understand things, in different countries.
Yeah.
They're in quite a unique position.
Would you have expected a reasonably competent fire engineer to have been familiar with industry guidance, including, say, BR 135 or the BCA, Building Control Alliance guidance, or the CWCT guidance?
Yeah, so BR 135, remember, is written into approved document B.
Yes.
Yes. The BCA guidance, I mean, I don't know if you're asking me to comment on this as a result of...
No, I'm asking you
Just
in a more
generally-
freestanding way.
Oh, in a freestanding
So
way.
obviously the BCA guidance comes out first in June 14
Yeah,
and then in
yeah.
15.
And it was, you know, that reflected some of the disquiet being raised at the time. So the BCA guide was issued. It was controversial in itself. And I think, so substantial companies like Exova would have known about that. They're also quoted in that guidance, so their staff must surely have known about it. And then the CWCT guidance, I think, to be fair there, I think it would be more likely you'd be familiar with that if you worked in a multidisciplinary company rather than a fire safety engineering on its own. But it is quoted, you know, it is referenced.
Yeah.
Quite commonly.
Would you have expected a reasonably competent fire engineer to be aware of and have read the new edition of BR 135 that came out in 2013?
Yes.
Now, if we can go to EXO 401444, this is a chain of emails that between Terry Ashton and Tony Pearson about that second issue of the Exova fire safety strategy.
Yeah.
And in this chain of emails, Mr. Ashton and Dr. Pearson discussed their different opinions regarding whether the shared stair between the residential and the non-residential parts of the building should be flagged as a deviation from standard guidance.
Yeah.
Do you recall that?
Yeah.
And in the final email at the top of the page, Mr. Ashton states, Tony, I told Mags to send the report out without reading what you'd added. Had I been able to read it, I would not have agreed to the amendment, as what you've said highlights the non-compliance with codified guidance, but more importantly is debatable. Let's hope that Paul Hansen doesn't pick up on it, Terry. And if you recall, what had happened is Dr. Pearson had peer reviewed it and had said he would like to add in some text, making clear that that was a deviation from, I think, approved document B. Is that correct?
He was right to do that, yes.
Yeah. Now, what I want to ask you is, if we go back to your report, page 99, 4.7.81, you say there, I do not understand why Mr. Ashton would hope Paul Hansen, a member of RBKC Building Control, would not pick up on a rather fundamental breach of the building regulations.
Yeah.
And then you say, I don't consider this professional behaviour. Can you just explain why, in your view, any reasonably competent fire engineer would have highlighted that departure from the relevant guidance in that fire strategy report?
Because, like I said, the detailed fire safety strategy is a record of the provisions, why they're there, any deviations, any residual risks, you know, important information to serve as a record about that building and the work done to create that fire safety design. So that people by being transparent and clear, the readers of that report, and there will be all different types for all different reasons, should it impact their decision making, they have the ability to understand that and factor it into their decision making.
Mr. Ashton clearly indicated that he didn't agree with the proposed addition.
Yeah.
Was that view within the range of valid professional opinion at the time?
Yeah, I think, did he say it was a minor or disputable, what I think it was
Yeah, let's go back to the
point,
email.
sorry.
EXO 401444. He said, I wouldn't have agreed to the amendment as what you've said highlights the non-compliance, but more importantly is debatable.
Yeah, okay, so there's two things.
Do you think it was a debatable issue?
So what may be debatable is the risk to life it causes. He agrees that it's a non-compliance. So it's like, so any deviation or non-compliance will either pose a risk to life, or there's another mitigation and you're satisfied that with that mitigation, the deviation in itself is acceptable on the project because you factored it in to all the other protection measures that you're proposing.
And just to be clear, even though the guidance in approved document B isn't compulsory, we know they aren't the building regulations, they're just the practical guidance, is it still your view that the deviation from that guidance should have been flagged up?
Yeah, so if you offer to write a detailed fire safety strategy that's compliant with the building regulations and you rely on approved document B, it's important to explain where there's deviations and how you've dealt with that in a transparent way. So all the different readers, as I've said, can factor that into their own work and their own decisions.
Yeah. Yes, now I want to move to a different topic now, a peer review process, just before we look at issue 3. I'd like to do today with you. Just a few questions about the peer review process that's applied at Exova. As we've seen, Exova's reports would be written by one member of the team and then reviewed by another member of the team. Can you just help us? Was peer review common in the context of fire engineering at this time?
I typically associate the phrase peer review with an external party coming into a company and reviewing our work. I think in this context, well, I call it, it's like the checking and approvals process, the in-house quality assurance process. So in that context, by that definition of peer review, it is common in fire safety engineering companies.
Yes. And you tell us in your report that at Arup, such review is carried out by a project director who you define as a chartered professional. Is that right?
Yes.
And you say that the purpose of such a peer review is to ensure that each deliverable is technically correct, accurate and fit for purpose for which the deliverable was to be put.
Yes.
Now, within Exova, there's no definition of peer review within Exova's main project phase procedure or their overall review procedure. And we see that frequently reports are reviewed by somebody junior to the author of the report. Now, in your view, is that ever acceptable to have a review done by a junior person?
No, because they're more inexperienced.
And you've also noted in your report that there's a divergence in evidence of the Exova witnesses on what the nature of peer review within Exova meant.
Yes.
So we have James Lee saying it was to check that it was accurate and reasonable. We have Mr. McElhaney saying it's proofreading and checking for clear mistakes. We have Claire Barker saying that you review the report alongside the drawings, the relevant guidance, and ADB in order to ensure the report was correct. Ms. Cooney described it as part of the document control exercise, and then we get a much more detailed explanation of exactly what ought to be done in Tony Pearson's witness statement. And you've commented on some of this at pages 97 to 98 of your report.
Yeah.
Would you agree that in order to be meaningful, peer review must entail a genuine evaluation of the deliverable document, viewed in light of a scrutiny of the underlying drawings and the documentation, coupled with checking the engineering assumptions and calculations?
Yes, I would for the final detailed fire strategy, yes.
And is it right that you don't consider the peer review exercise, either for the existing fire safety strategy or the refurbishment fire safety strategy, to have been satisfactory?
Yeah, because I'd expect any other competent person at Exova to have noticed, if we want to go back to B4 again, that the two parts had not been considered.
Yeah.
And to raise a query as to why not.
Yeah. Now I want to turn to issue 3 of the outline fire safety strategy. And if we pull that up, this is at EXO 401107. So this is dated the 7th of November 2013. So in contrast to the previous version, which was the 24th of October 2013, we can see on page 2, it's Mr. Ashton that's written it, and then, like with issue 1, it's Mr. McElhaney who has reviewed it. Page 4, we don't have any description of overcladding in the introduction. And then the B4 section on page 9 remains unchanged.
Yeah.
And it's got exactly the same statement there that we saw before. And just to be clear, what do you think should have been said under B4 by this time?
Well, this was they were now in stage E, and this was to be the final detailed fire safety strategy, recording the detailed proposals for the development. So whatever analysis had been in Mr. Ashton's mind now needed to have been presented in this version.
Yes, so you would by now expect to see not just the performance requirements, but some analysis.
The analysis. If they offered analysis, and this is the detailed fire safety strategy, and that's where the analysis goes.
Yeah. Now, can I take you to some email exchanges that Mr. Ashton exchanges with Studio E just before this issue?
Yeah.
And it's an email exchange that occur on the 1st and the 4th of November 2013, so just a few days before this. If we go to EXO 50586, and I want to pick this up on the bottom of the first page. There, Mr. Reck says on the 1st of November, evening Terry, can you please confirm that the rain screen cavity fire barriers are to be 60-minute FR to match the compartmentation? Thank you. Regards, Thomas. And he then, Mr. Ashton then responds, if we go up the page, at 9:05 on the 4th of November, and he says this, cavity barriers need only have a 30-minute standard of fire resistance. Kind regards, Terry. Now, pausing there, do you think that the email from Mr. Reck ought to have alerted Mr. Ashton to the fact that Studio E did in fact need guidance on the building regulations and approved document B requirements for the external wall?
Well, that's why they contacted Exova.
Now, what do you think Mr. Ashton ought to have done as a reasonably competent fire engineer in response to this request?
Can we just put the original request up, if you don't mind?
Yeah, it's the bottom
please?
of page 1.
Yeah. So, as far as I'm concerned, can you confirm the rain screen cavity barriers are to be 60 minutes? So the first question is, what cavity fire barriers are you referring to? And I would want to understand exactly what Thomas Reck meant, okay? And because there's the location of the cavity barriers and then their fire performance.
Yeah. And Do you think that this exchange should have affected what Mr. Ashton then included in issue 3 of his outlined fire safety strategy on the 7th of November 2013?
Well, yes, because his strategy doesn't refer to any guidance on cavity barriers, and the design team clearly needed some guidance. That's why they contacted their fire safety engineer.
And just to be clear, do you think Mr. Ashton should have asked for more information before giving this advice?
I mean, he said 30 minutes. I mean, that's the minimum you could say. I think it would have been safer for him to ask the location of the cavity barriers Thomas Reck was referring to, and then to notice that the design team were unsure, and a quick check of his own report would have shown him it didn't contain any information about cavity barriers.
Yeah. Do you think this ought to have prompted him to have referenced the locations that cavity barriers ought to have been fitted to comply with Section 9 of ADB in the next version of his report?
Yes, I do.
And do you think that the fact that he didn't do all of that fell below the standard of a reasonably competent fire engineer?
Yes, I do.
On cavity barriers around windows, in your experience, was it common at the time for construction professionals in general not to appreciate that cavity barriers around windows were required?
It was a common defect, yes.
But was there any reasonable doubt amongst fire engineers about whether cavity barriers were in fact required around openings?
Was there any reasonable doubt?
Debate.
Debate?
Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
No. So you can't imagine any reasonably competent fire engineer advising that you could avoid having cavity barriers around the windows?
If for some reason the design was struggling to incorporate a cavity barrier around a window, then a reasonably competent fire safety engineer would have to come up with a mitigation, otherwise insist that the cavity barriers were installed.
Yeah. Now, as to what information was available about the external wall build-up as at November 2013, can we look at something said in Exover's opening submissions again? If we go to EXO 401774, page 14, and we look at paragraph 4.12. Now, here, Exover are making submissions about that final issue 3 of the fire strategy.
Yeah.
And if we pick it up in the 4th line, having set out what the report said, they say, at the time, the intention appears to have been to use a system comprised of zinc panels with aluminium honeycomb insulation, but no detailed specification or design had been set. Even if the material supplied to Exover for the preparation of its report has explicitly indicated as much, Exover's report could properly have made the same comment. And I want to get your response to that. So they're making the point that at the time, certainly the primary system that was being considered was the zinc panels with the honeycomb core, the Proteus zinc honeycomb. And they're making the point that in those circumstances, even if more material had been supplied to them, Exover's report could probably have said the same thing. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't.
Can you help us as to why?
Yeah, so just again to remember, this is Exover's Stage E report, their detailed fire safety strategy. I understand that one of 4 proposals was the zinc with the aluminium honeycomb, and understand the context that they weren't asked for their opinion about any of those particular products.
Yeah.
But the insulation performance taken together with the external surface is relevant at stage E when you're preparing your detailed fire safety strategy, making clear the minimum requirements.
Right. So that's back to the fact that you say it should have been flagged up that any insulation should have been compliant with 12.7
Yes.
of ADB.
Yes, and I think, I don't know what date this text is referring to, but there were 4 products in the specification.
You mean in the NBS specification?
In the NBS specification, 2 of which were zinc, and the other zinc product was a polymeric zinc panel.
Yeah. So you don't agree that it would have been acceptable for Exova simply to say that such panels would have no adverse effect but will be considered in a detailed report later?
No, I don't, because it's the panel and the insulation and the cavity barriers taken together.
Yeah.
And I'm still struggling on the analysis for that part of B4
Yeah.
that is intended now,
Yeah.
as having been intended.
So you would
then.
expect some analysis by reference to the materials that are being proposed of how the B4 requirement is going to be met.
So in B4 in their report, I would expect their analysis for space separation, because that was the common analysis at the time.
Yeah.
And if they did no checking of the materials, which was common practice,
Yeah.
okay, they needed to set out the required performance in their fire safety strategy, because all the different parts of the 5 parts are interconnected and interrelated, and Exova needed to understand the intention of B4.
Yeah. Now, I just want to look at what you say at page 101 of your report now, paragraph 4.7.104. You say there, having considered the later iterations of the fire safety strategy, however, as I set out in section 47107, Exova simply reissued their Stage C report in both October and November 2013 to be included in the tender documents. They did not issue a Stage E fire strategy, nor any report that could be considered commensurate with Stage F1 level of detailed information. You see that there?
Yeah.
Now, we know that Mr. Ashton had some discussions with Mr. Soons over the course of September through to November 2013 on the updating of Studio E's fire drawings.
Yes.
You recall that?
Yeah.
And those were reflected in some changes to Exova's report.
Yes.
And Mr. Soames accepted in his oral evidence that the focus of his discussions with Exova had been on the lower floors
Yes.
and the internal works and layouts.
Yeah.
For the transcript, the reference is day 12, page 153, lines 13 to 19. So the point I want to put to you is, isn't it actually the case that this was an updated report in light of the discussions between Mr. Ashton and Mr. Soons on those aspects of the design that Studio E had been discussing with Exova? And it was only later that Studio E, on their own initiative, decided to include that report in the tender documents.
So you mean that Exova failed to deliver their Stage E detailed fire strategy entirely?
I know that's your evidence, but
Yeah.
what I'm suggesting to you that it's in fact their report was amended in issue 3 to
Yes.
reflect the discussions that Mr. Soons and Mr. Ashton had been having about the lower levels.
Yes.
Was that not enough?
No, because it was time to write a Stage E detailed fire safety strategy. The architect or other professionals will ring you about their specific issues that's concerning them. The fire safety engineer's duty remains producing that detailed report. We are responsible for setting out the fire safety design principles in detail at that point.
Yeah. Now, in terms of your conclusions about issue 3, you've helpfully summarised your conclusions about that issue in section 6.9 of your report. That's pages 213 to 216. Can we just pull those up? So starting on page 213. I'm not going to ask you about all of these conclusions. We don't have time to do that. But I want to note at 6.9.12 at the bottom of that page, you say this: even in the absence of outline or detailed drawings or specifications for the components forming the external wall construction, there was a minimum piece of advice Exova could easily have provided. And then you say that was the performance requirements to comply with B41 and B42. So that's the point you've been making just now. And then if we go on to page 214, yes, if we look at 6.9.14, you then say another substantial omission from this final report was its failure to identify the works that were required to be undertaken in the lobbies on each of the existing floors of the building to accommodate the improvements to the building services. Yes? And then you say there at the bottom, the works to the lobby smoke control system. Can we just move down on that page? 6.9.15. Are described in a single note, indicating that Max Forden was solely responsible for the performance, specification and design of the system. And then if we can look at page 216, 6.9.24, you also say, ultimately, Exova did not provide a set of fire strategy drawings to accompany issue 3 of their report. In fact, specific reference to the Studio E drawing numbers for the fire access and fire strategy drawings were removed, and no other specific design documentation was referenced. So just pausing there, you're critical of the fact that there was no set of fire strategy drawings accompanying that third issue of the report. Is that correct?
Yes, because you need the detailed information on the drawings with the narrative, the detailed narrative in the report to understand the basis for the fire safety design. We tend to not produce our own drawings. We tend to mark up others' drawings. Other fire safety companies do a set of fire safety drawings.
Yeah. And then in the next section of your report, 610, you compare the scope of the report with what Exova had promised in their fee proposal, and you compare it with approved document B. And then if we go on page 224, at section 612, you set out your conclusions on the adequacy of the primary refurbishment fire strategy. And you say in 612.2 at the top there, based on the evidence I presented, it's my opinion that Exova's outline fire safety strategy report was wholly inadequate with respect to providing relevant fire safety design guidance to the design team, the client and the contractor. And you go through a number of failings, including not dealing properly with B3 and B4 in that next section. And then you're also critical at the bottom of 226, if we can go to that, 612.30, of the fact that there's no reference back to the existing fire safety strategy. Is that right?
Yes.
The two weren't linked together.
Yes.
There was no reference to that work. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And then if you go... yes, so those are your conclusions. Now, I've done that at some speed because you've set out your conclusions in detail there. Can I ask you whether anything you heard in the oral evidence of any of the Exova witnesses, or indeed any other witnesses, has caused you to change your views in any way about those conclusions?
Sadly not, no.
No. Mr. Chairman, I think that is
that a convenient
good moment.
point? Well, it is.
At the moment, I'm supposed to stop as well.
Yes.
So I will be carrying on dealing with this topic tomorrow morning, and then we will get to the other two reports tomorrow afternoon.
All right. Well, it is the time of day when we normally finish for the afternoon.
Okay.
So that's what we're going to do.
Good.
I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to come back for some more evidence tomorrow, but I think you were expecting that, weren't you?
I was expecting that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Okay.
And the usual injunction, please don't talk to anyone about your
I won't.
evidence
Okay.
or anything to do with it overnight.
No problem.
All right?
Yep.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, Ms.
Thank
Page.
you.
Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.
Thanks.
Thank you.